tired of sleeping. Overview. When the citadels of Axos became signatories of the Liberty Pact, they freed all of their slaves. Never a nation that was particularly invested in slavery, and one where the Empire had been carefully eroding their commitment to the vile practice for some years. There weren't all that many slaves to be free. Most of the slaves, human slaves, were swallowed up by the seething melting pot of the lowest classes, and that might have been that, if not for the fact that a significant number of the Axu slaves were orcs. Fearing that the orcs might foment rebellion, or somehow serve as spies or agents for the Druj or the Grendel, the Grand Ilarks, the rulers of Axos, imposed draconian laws that severely restricted their rights, while technically recognising them as citizens. During the autumn equinox, Skywise Grauke raised a statement of principle to the Imperial Orc National Assembly, calling out the situation in Axos and demanding action. Following this, during the winter solstice, Grauke was empowered by the Assembly of Nine to enact a mandate urging fleet captains to go to Axos and offer the orcs a new life in the Empire, whether the Axu liked it or not. From the Book of Salt. Imperial fleets have brought every orc who wanted to leave Axos to the Empire. A small number of human former slaves have also taken advantage of this rescue effort. The citadels of Axos are not pleased. Just shy of 120 Imperial fleet captains took the challenge of the Imperial Orcs and sailed to Axos following the winter solstice on a mission of mercy. Every single nation was represented by at least one captain, with the Brass Coast and Navarre making a particularly strong showing. These ships visited not only the docks at the towers of Cantor and the chambers of Isik, but also the less accessible docks beneath the halls of Makop. While the ships travelled with trade goods to sell on the docks, they did not fill their holds for the return journey. They were not truly there to trade, but to offer the orc citizens of Axos refuge in the Empire, whether the Isles and Ilarks liked it or not. With many of these fleets sailed reavers and preachers there to offer sanctuary of Skarsind to their fellow orcs. The expectation was that they would need to hunt out the orcs to spread the news of the opportunity to escape Axos. In the end, there was no need. To the surprise of the Imperial captains, they arrived to find a great many former orc slaves already waiting for them. While Snowbound Ducker and their friends had done their best to spread the news of the coming ships, it seemed every orc in Axos had heard they were coming. On the docks of Cantor, Isik and Makop waited orcs who had travelled from across the length and breadth of the nation, carrying all their worldly goods with them. A sea of serious, expectant faces awaited the first Imperial vessels to reach Axos. There was little in the way of pushing and shoving, at least not from the orcs. People were content to wait their turn, quietly confident that everyone would be able to find a berth. They spoke of having received a message shortly after the winter solstice, voices speaking in their dreams, telling them of a grey old orc and Imperial ships with white wings, of equal chances and choices, and a new mountainous homeland. Some spoke of the flutterings of unseen wings in the night, or of their certainty that it was the voices of their ancestors that spoke to them. So they came. By ones and twos at first, and then in greater numbers they came. The Ilarks tried to stop them. Others saw their exodus as proof of some paranoid fantasy about an uprising. Blood was spilled, but still they came. Once it became clear that this visionary dream, and the words of the preachers, were true, even more arrived. Every Imperial vessel left laden down with families ready to risk everything to get out of Axos and go somewhere where they actually were wanted. Many of those boarding Imperial vessels offered payment, a handful of Axu coins, a few measures of beggarwood, an ingot of metal, or a carefully hoarded mana crystal. Some captains took the payment. Many did not. It was not just the orcs waiting on the dock. They weren't many, but there were a few scattered handfuls of humans, also former slaves who wanted to leave Axos. Most had heard by word of mouth that the orcs were leaving, and sought to throw in their lot with their fellow former slaves. It seemed the lives of many former human slaves were not that much better than their orc neighbours. They were uncertain of their welcome at first, but few ship captains had the heart to turn them away. They were also embarrassingly keen to make it to the Bay of Katazar. Most of them are likely to end up making new lives in the League or the Brass Coast, but a few will wander further afield and find new homes in Dawn or Wintermark or even Varushka. There were a few altercations. where Axu soldiers tried to disperse the crowds at the docks, but the presence of so many Imperial witnesses obviously made the Ilarks cautious. While the Liberty Pact does not demand that a nation treat its citizens well, there is no doubt that fear of what the Imperial captains might report that made the masters of the citadels cautious. As the season draws to an end, and the last few Imperial ships left the docks of Axos with their living cargo, a significant number of Commonwealth ships turned up on their own mission of mercy, only to find that there was almost nobody left to rescue. Rather than being annoyed at their wasted journey, the Commonwealth ship captains seemed surprisingly pleased that the Empire had taken its own steps to deal with their neighbouring nation. While most of the captains and their attendant marines set off on the long journey home, a number were inspired to come visit the Empire, putting them in a perfect position to assist the evacuation for Feroz, should the call come. The Tamazi. The former Orc slaves of Axos call themselves the Tamazi. These new Orcs are a very different proposition from the Liberated, the former soldiers and gladiators of Mariv, and the Septs of Ossium. For a start, they have already been technically free for almost a year by the time the Empire arrives. They are a lot more used to cities than many of the Imperial Orcs. The vast majority of them lived in one of the 4 remaining citadels as servants and menial labourers. For many, this is the first time they have not been within sight of stone walls or under slate roofs, and quite a few evidence unease and even anxiety during the long sea voyage, preferring to stay below decks. Just as many seem to revel in the chance to see something new, and have been asked to stop distracting the mariners with their constant questions. One Dornish sailor comments that it is like having a leaguish citizen away from their home for the first time, only they're an orc, and they don't go on and on and on about the theatre. The joke spreads from ship to ship. Reaching the Empire, there are plenty of guides to help them make the long trek overland to Skarsind. The ox cart vendors of Sarvos do a roaring trade in the month after the former Axos orcs arrive, and caravans heading towards Temeshwar are swollen with orcs, both Imperial and otherwise. During this journey, the Imperial orcs escorting them get their first chance to really get to know the newcomer orcs. Most importantly, they don't consider themselves Axu. They were never really citizens after all. They refer to themselves as the Tamazi, a very old word from a language that has long since faded from the world. It translates roughly as united or possibly bound, in the context of both bound together and chained. It's a term that some of their ancestors use, and now they are no longer in Axos, many of them are openly using the term again. It seems Snowbound Ducker had misunderstood a few details about the Tamazi. Unlike the Imperial Orcs, they technically share a single origin even before they were enslaved. The Axu do not capture or enslave Orcs in war, they simply kill them. Given that the Axu mostly fight the Druj, this is unsurprising. A very small number speak of having some distant connection to the Orcs of the Broken Shore, but they are few and far between, and the links are often since attenuated. Rather, the Tamazi claim descent from several large Orc families who live in what is today Axos before the coming of the victorious Axis. Some of their ancestors remember a time when there were 4 families, but after their people were slaughtered by the Axu and chained, they were forced to put aside their differences to survive. There are still strong bonds of identity between the Orcs who lived as slaves in particular citadels, but they are all united by half a dozen shared ancestors whose voices they hear loudly and clearly. Some of these ancestors are the unhelpful kind familiar to the Imperial Orcs, the ones who urge them to fight. But the ones they listen to are the clever, wise ones. When their blood pumps, their ancestors urge them to trust their instincts, to look for ways to turn situations to their advantage, avoid direct conflict, and rely on their companions. Put simply, the Tamazi consider themselves to be a single, albeit large, very extended family. The relationship they have with the spirits of their ancestors have come from the echoes of the Axu near worship of their forebears, and maintaining ties to those ancestors who hold memories of a time before their descendants were enslaved. Many of them carry bones that have come from a revered ancestor handed down one to another over generations. Some of these bones are apparently very old. Indeed, the Tamazi seem to take particular pleasure in making ornamentation and decoration out of bones. Most have jewellery of scrimshawed or painted bone, sometimes orc, but more often animal in origin. They are especially fond of dragon bone, eschewing materials such as gold, silver, orichalcum or welt silver to make their decorations. The egregore is here, alongside the other Imperial Orcs talking to the newcomers and patiently answering their questions. There is something about the Tamazi that makes them much less resistant to the idea of joining the Imperial Orcs than the Septs of Ossian. Each night when the caravans rest, dozens of them become part of the nation, inspired by their guides and welcomed by their new siblings. Like any Imperial Orc, they want many different things. Some of them plan to settle in Gildenheim. Craving the familiarity of a city, they are full of enthusiasm for one where they will be accepted as equals. Some of them, by contrast, are enthused about the idea of getting away from the cities and carving out new homes for themselves, building for their own future rather than at the command of human masters. When these latter orcs learn that any Imperial citizen who serves 2 years in the Imperial army receives a good plot of land, there is understandably quite a lot of interest. The Call of Magic. The Tamazi are very keen to master the magic that the Aksu tried to deny them. What all these orcs want, however, is magic. They see the freedom to learn and practice magic openly as a key part of their liberation. Unlike those orcs who have previously been subjects of the Druj, the Grendel and the Yarmish, there are already a small number of spellcasters among them. While knowledge of magic was severely punished by the Aksu, this didn't prevent them from nurturing their traditions in secret. There are not many Tamazi magicians, but there are those among them who do understand all of the familiar helpful spells. Only a small number of them are familiar with warlike incantations, however. Spells such as weakness or repel are generally less useful for survival than heal or purify, too difficult to practice and too obviously dangerous to their Aksu masters. Their magical tradition seems to be similar to the necromantia. They call on their ancestors and the spirits of the dead to help them work their magic. Very few of them possess ritual magic, but there is a smattering of all the laws among these Tamazi magicians. By Imperial standards, it is laughably rudimentary, and the largest actual coven among the former Axos slaves is only 4 people. Only in the realm of winter magic is there anything approaching Imperial expertise, and even then there is only a limited number of rituals and nothing like Imperial law. This means that they are unable to perform any rituals spontaneously, only rituals they have mastered. The only exception to this are the small numbers of magicians the Tamazi call bone carvers, and they are a very different matter. Bone carvers. The bone carvers are Tamazi magicians who practice ritual magic creating bone amulets. The bone carvers are part of a small sect among the Aksu orcs, whose magical abilities far outstrip those of their peers. They are treated with great respect by the other Tamazi. While all the Tamazi favour bone jewellery or amulets, the bone carvers are notable in that they bedeck themselves in amulets and talismans of carved or painted bone. Most of them are adept at making small charms and amulets out of bone, beautiful pieces of art for the most part, but some of them infused with dragon bone possess magical powers. At first it seems they are spiritual leaders akin to priests or perhaps shamans. Once the Tamazi feel more comfortable with the Imperial Orcs, however, the truth becomes clear. Most of them are indeed shaman, but the real reason they are so respected is that they are accomplished wizards and repositories of magical lore stretching back to the days before the coming of the humans. Their magic is still quite limited compared to that of the Imperial Orcs, and focuses around subtle protection and healing, with a strong flavour of the necromantia about it. Several of their rituals were used to protect people from the ghosts and unliving threats of the Axos undercities, with one of the most potent being similar to hold back frozen hunger, but with a much longer duration. Other than that, they speak in guarded tones of the ability to send a bound ghost to deliver a message, allowing the Tamazi to keep contact with their peers in other citadels, with the Aksu being any the wiser. The Bone Weavers claim that while some of these rituals were learnt in the secret of Aksu libraries, the others were handed down to them by their ancestors. Between them, they apparently know several rituals that they have never performed due to fear of the magically adept Aksu discovering them, taking their secrets and executing them. For the moment, none of the bone carvers have joined the nation. Although they are not hostile to the idea, they are biding their time. Given time, and given a good enough reason to trust the Orcs of Scarsint, however, it is entirely possible that they will become Imperial Orcs in their own right, and perhaps share this knowledge with their new nation. The College of Warcasting. The Tamazi are keen to study at the College of Warcasting in Scarsint, but for them to do so, the grounds will need to be extended. Altering the commission will require 12 wains of weirwood, 24 crowns, and take 3 months. It will likely require a Senate motion. If the college is amended, the Tamazi will provide magic items of use to warcasters to the preceptor. This will help speed the assimilation of the Tamazi into the Imperial Orcs. When they learn of the Skarsin College of Warcasting in Estermark, several hundred of these new Orcs immediately petition to be allowed to attend. This creates a problem. The college is by no means large enough to accommodate so many students at once. And of course the former Aksu are not the only Orcs who want to attend. The college was never intended to cater to so many students. There are already a number of sandfishers studying here along the more usual Imperial Orc students. To allow so many Tamazi to join the College of Warcasting, the facilities will need to be expanded. The kind of expansion needed will most likely require a Senate motion. The Legion Engineer cannot amend an existing commission. The proposed expansion would cost 12 wains of weirwood and 24 crowns in labour. It would require a commission, as with any other amendment, and would take 3 months to complete the work. If the expansion is built, it would allow the college to deal with much larger classes eager to learn magic. In return for opening the doors to the Tamazi, they will offer their own expertise in working with Dragonbone to supply the preceptor with magic items useful to warcasters, and it would be up to them as to how to distribute these items to best serve the nation. This would function as a ministry, with the preceptor able to effectively purchase magic rods, shields, and mage armour from Tamazi artisans. Religious problems. The Tamazi are not very religious. They have some esoteric beliefs about the Howling Abyss, but minimal interest in the way. The Tamazi are not particularly a religious people, certainly not in the way the Imperial Orcs are. But for once this works in the Empire's favour. While they are not especially excited about the way, or the concept of virtues they cannot touch, neither are they resistant to it. They honour their ancestors perhaps a little more enthusiastically than some of the neighbours might like, but they don't try to evangelise their beliefs particularly. They aren't demanding special temples. Any household who wants to is quite capable of building their own shrine to a revered spirit. They aren't insisting on special treatment from the preachers, and there are certainly some among them who are open to hearing about the virtues. They believe in the creed that orcs have one life, and they believe that by emulating and listening to their ancestors they can cross the Howling Abyss. Mostly they seem politely disinterested in those elements of a religion that relies on special spiritual forces that orcs cannot wield, although a philosophy they don't seem to have a problem with being ambitious, loyal, courageous, or what have you. Actually, there might be a minor fly in the ointment. One of their more esoteric beliefs is that the Howling Abyss was made by a jealous creator, intended to stop orc spirits from joining with their ancestors. It also seems that the Tamazi Bonecasters disagree slightly with the Imperial Orcs about what happens to spirits that fall into the Howling Abyss. Rather than being consigned to oblivion, they believe that orc spirits are torn apart and regurgitated to form part of the ethereal matter from which new orc spirits are created. They don't believe in reincarnation, just that the abyss spits out the shreds of an orc spirit once it is finished with it, and that fragments of memory or identity might go on to form a new orc spirit. Perhaps if they were a little more prone to evangelizing, this might be a problem. It remains to be seen if the Synod is prepared to tolerate this peculiar fringe belief. The easiest way to handle this problem would be to ignore it. The Tamazi aren't interested in being forcibly converted to the Way, but that's mostly because they aren't a particularly religious people. They won't reject the Imperial Orc Assembly out of hand, but they'll likely ignore any urging to embrace the Way that isn't specifically aimed at them. If the Assembly does try to encourage them to convert, we'll need to handle the approach very carefully, and it is more likely to alienate them to get them to embrace the Way at this point. So much to do. The Tamazi are enthusiastically settling in Skarsind. Many are choosing to join the nation, while not giving up their familial identity. Regardless of this, by the time the spring equinox dawns, there will be several thousand Tamazi orcs finding new homes in Skarsind. Unlike the Septs, they don't seem particularly worried about spreading out over the territory. While many settle in Gildenheim, swelling the population even more, there are families establishing themselves in many regions. They rely on their bone weavers to keep in contact with the rest of their extended family, both those who have become Imperial Orcs and those who have not. Tamasi in play. At the moment, it is not possible for a player to create a character who was one of the Tamazi. While many of them have embraced the nation, they are still exploring what it means to be Imperial Orcs. Many of them will be keeping a slight distance between themselves and their neighbours, albeit nowhere near as standoffish as some of the Septs have been. Opportunities to get a closer understanding of the Tamazi and their role in the nation are likely to be available over the coming events. Tamazi look and feel. Like their former human masters, the Tamazi favour robes. Where the Aksu favour voluminous shroud-like robes, the Tamazi wear tighter, more practical hooded robes suited to those who have often had to engage in hard labour, with sleeves that come down over the wrists. They favour dark colours and hard-wearing materials. Even freed, they are still more comfortable wearing this kind of robe. The rest of their clothing has an eclectic thrown-together look very similar to that of the Imperial Orcs. Used to wearing hand-me-downs, and heavily repaired ones at that, they might easily be mistaken for their Scarsin neighbours by an outsider. Many naturally favour the neck and wrist wrappings seen among the Imperial Orcs for the same reason, to cover the scars caused by manacles, and those who join the Imperial Orcs are likely to embrace them in the same way. Finally, also like many Imperial Orcs, the Tamazi favour bone charms and accoutrements. Often carefully scrimshawed, painted or carved, it is not uncommon for a former Axos slave to have at least one bone that used to physically be part of one of their ancestors. These ancestor bones are treated in much the same way as Imperial Orcs treat items of worth. They put a high value on Dragonbone, particularly favouring it in its use in jewellery or decoration of an important weapon. Diplomatic incident. The citadels of Axos appear to be angry with the Empire. Imperial fleets suffer a 3-rank penalty to trade with the ports of Cantor or Issyk. The ambassador to Axos is Tarquinius of Urizen. While the Tamazi are glad to be free of Axos, the Axos themselves are not so happy. There is no widespread violence in the face of the Exodus, but the rulers of Axos are livid that the Empire choose to ignore their wishes and interfere in their internal politics in such a disrespectful, ham-fisted manner. The Grand Ilarchs, the leaders of the citadels, have apparently convened an emergency council to discuss what they are going to do about this affront to their sovereignty. The first obvious effect is that Imperial fleets are going to receive a chilly reception in Axos in the coming month. This will manifest as a 3-rank penalty to the production of any fleet trading with the ports of Cantor or Issyk following the spring equinox. The civil service predict that the penalty will slowly drop away. People have short memories, assuming nothing else happens to anger the Ilarchs. The ambassador to Axos may know more, and with any further repercussions likely outlined in their civil service briefing. Founding of the nation. The Imperial Orcs are giving a thought to how they might celebrate the 60-year anniversary of the foundation of their nation. A festival is being discussed to take place at the autumn equinox. During the winter solstice, there were 2 statements of principle in the Imperial Orc National Assembly that spoke of the pride of their nation. Skywise Fowl spoke of the need to protect the nation, the long overdue reward for the work of our lives. Bleakshield Rook pointed out that 384YE marks 60 years since the Imperial Orcs earned their freedom, encouraging every citizen to celebrate both past and future. The autumn equinox this year marks the anniversary of Araz's offer to the Orcs of Thrace's rebellion, full citizenship to any Orc who would swear to serve the Empire, and freedom for all enslaved Orcs. The anniversary is only 6 months away. The date is recognised in various ways among the Imperial Orcs over the years, but this is the first time there has been talk of something to officially mark the founding of the nation with a formal celebration. The Night of Worth is due to be celebrated during the coming summit, both in Anvil and in communities across Scarsind. The festival itself is fairly intimate, a time for Orcs to gather together and share stories about themselves and the things of worth that they carry. It feels like a celebration of the founding of the nation, and ultimately the liberation that the Imperial Orcs won for themselves through rebellion and refusal to compromise might merit something more extrovert in nature. There is still time for discussion. Discussion with the Egregore is one place to start, as might statements in the National Assembly encouraging a certain tenor to the celebration. The final test, however, will be the actual celebration itself. If the Orcs who come to Anvil are successful in creating something iconic that enjoys popular support of the nation, then it will be embraced far and wide, become a regular tradition amongst the Imperial Orcs. Bones in the Earth. A Varushkan statement of principle has prompted interest in how the Varushkans might help the Imperial Orcs. During the solstice, Yavanshka of the Varushkan National Assembly proposed a statement of principle regarding the shadows of the past. It was upheld by the Assembly with a greater majority, with primacy in fact. It spoke of how Varushka's virtue is tarnished by the legacy of slavery and the need to address this legacy and rectify it. Some elements of the statement are broadly well received. The reality is that precious most folk in Varushka have gained a grudging respect for the Imperial Orcs. They have a territory of their own now, and their two large armies are a terror to the Empire's enemies. From a military point of view, it's a toss-up between them and Dawn for who would make the better allies. They are also clever traders, skilled magicians, and it's clear that the Empire has been enriched by their presence. Most Varushkans are happy to consider an opportunity to make amends for the crimes of the past. Less popular is the way the judgment seems to single out Varushka. Many Varushkans find it tiresome to be repeatedly portrayed as the only people in the Empire who practice slavery. The plain facts are that the rest of the Empire was no different. Every nation, other than the freeborn, kept orcs as slaves for centuries. The farms of Wintermark and the Marches, the fighting pits of the League, the forests of Dawn and Navarre were all worked by orc slaves just as much as the Varushkan mines were. Even the Urizen kept slaves. Not every job can be done by Ushabti, and not every spire has magicians to spare to oversee their operation. It's not just the Empire either, for that matter. Varushkans fought brutal wars with the Druj and the Thule, and other antecedents of the Imperial Orcs, all of whom took every opportunity to slave the enemies they defeated. But every civilized person now accepts that slavery was wrong, and there is a genuine enthusiasm for the idea of finding a way to make amends, even if it rankles some to see the Varushkan singled out. There is, however, some concern over the idea of digging up bones of those who have been dead for decades or even centuries. There is an absolute mountain of human and orc remains out there, many of them buried in unmarked graves. Is it right to disturb those graves, assuming they could even be located, to move the bones to a place none of these orcs has ever even heard of? Worse, in Varushka, in particular, it seems incredibly dangerous to go digging up graves, especially when those buried in them might be angry or vengeful. Sometimes it is best to leave the past buried, as the wise ones say. Of course, Yavenshka and Bloodcrow Udu will know what they are doing, and will most certainly be able to exhume the remains of scores of orcs without disturbing more than a handful of dark powers. But most people are looking for a simple way to demonstrate their friendship with the Imperial Orcs, something a little easier, a little safer, but also arguably something a little more expensive. You can't pay for lives with coin, but the Wintermarkers know what they're doing when they send a mediator to settle a blood feud. People actually want to demonstrate genuine remorse. If they want to prove their regret, they want to take real action to make amends, then they put their money where their mouth is. By good fortune, an opportunity to do so might just have arisen. Yavanshka plans to repatriate the bones of former orc slaves to Skarsind, where they might be interred with honour. But that raises the question of where so many bones might be stored. The obvious answer could be in the Great Ossuary the Ilram asked the Imperial Orcs to build. The bones could surely be stored there. During the winter solstice, Stormcrow Skred addressed the concerns of the Ilram that their beliefs might not be welcome amongst the Imperial Orcs with a mandate upheld by their National Assembly. This has been well received, and now they are keen to begin rebuilding the bridge between themselves and their ancestors to cross the Howling Abyss. They are more relaxed in speaking about their beliefs in public, and when they learn of the possibility of the Imperial Orcs delving into their own past to recover the remnants of their own forerunners, they are interested in helping. As such, they are now even more keen to get to work on their great ossuary than before, and laying to rest the bones of the Imperial Orc ancestors next to the revered remains of their own people would be an ideal way to mark the coming together of the Sept and the nation. The problem is, of course, the cost. The ossuary would cost 60 wains of white granite, 120 crowns in labour, and take 6 months to complete. The Ilram are penniless. They have nothing they can contribute, and the Imperial Orcs have no bourse resources of their own to call on. Where, then, might 60 wains of white granite be found? No one wants to come out and suggest that the Varushkans build the whole thing, but the truth is they could if they wanted to. Varushka lacks the monetary wealth of the League or the rich fertile lands of the Marches, but it is the richest nation in the Empire for resources. There is a reason people choose to remain in this dark land. If the Assembly truly feels that Varushka should address the Empire's legacy of slavery, then what better way to discharge that debt than to actually help the Imperial Orcs right now? Why not work with them to build the ossuary the Ilrorm sect are so keen on? And if not, then the Grand Smithy of the Effengror, or the Palace of Flowers of the Yerenda we're talking about. Helping the Imperial Orcs strengthen their nation by incorporating one of the Septs of Ossium feels like a significantly more useful thing to do than focus on old bones and buried guilt. Much better to bury the hatchet once and for all and demonstrate that the Varushkans and the Imperial Orcs have a future together as friends and allies. After all, Varushka and the Imperial Orcs are neighbours now, and it's good for neighbours to be close, especially when night falls.